Death Valley is the hottest place in North America. It spreads across 2 states, Inyo County in California and Nye County in Nevada, and in summer, the ground there regularly passes 120 degrees. Most people see it from a paved road and leave before dark. What they drive past is stranger than what they came for. A house built out of 50,000 empty whiskey bottles, still standing after the city around it vanished. A ballerina who found a wrecked hall in a town of almost nobody and spent 6 years painting an audience onto the walls so the seats would never be empty. A fish that lives on one sunlit shelf of rock and nowhere else on Earth, which an earthquake in Japan can very nearly erase. And a dead flat lake bed where 700-pound rocks move across the mud on their own, carving trails hundreds of meters long. For a century, nobody saw it happen. Stick with us to the end, because that one is number 1 on this list. If you like these deep dives into places most maps skip, hit subscribe. We post one every week. Today we are counting down 10 places in Death Valley that should not exist. Number 10. Kettle Junction. The shrine nobody started. 21 miles down a dirt road at a fork in the middle of nothing, there is a wooden signpost buried under tea kettles. Dozens of them, hanging from the crossbar, wired to the posts, stacked at the base. Most have messages written on them or letters folded up inside. This is where the road from Ubahiba Crater splits toward Racetrack Playa in one direction and Hunter Mountain in the other, at 4,150 feet with high desert scrub and mountains on every horizon. No services, no cell signal. 21 miles of washboard gravel and a real risk of shredded tires. Nobody knows why the kettles are there. That is not a dramatic framing. That is the actual state of the research. One folk explanation says early travelers hung a kettle to signal water nearby. Another local story says the owner of the Lost Burrow mine left a kettle at the fork with its spout pointed toward the correct road for deliveries, and that a rival mine owner crept out and turned the spout toward his own claim instead. Neither version is documented anywhere. At some undated point, people simply started leaving kettles, and everyone who arrived afterward assumed there was a reason. Travelers have left kettles from Ukraine, Canada, and France. Also a frying pan. Also a hiking boot. And every so often, park rangers haul the whole collection away as litter. So the shrine you photograph today is not the shrine anyone photographed 5 years ago. It gets stripped bare and rebuilds itself over and over, entirely out of strangers. A tradition with no founder, no meaning, and no permanence, maintained perfectly by people who will never meet each other. Number 9. Rhyolite, Nevada. The city built from 50,000 bottles. 4 miles west of Beatty, on the eastern edge of Death Valley, there is a slope of bare volcanic hills with concrete skeletons standing on it. On August 4, 1904, 2 prospectors named Frank Harris and Ernest Cross found gold in the Bullfrog Hills. What happened next was fast even by gold rush standards. Within 2 years, the industrialist Charles M. Schwab had bought the Montgomery-Shoshone mine for a reported $5 million. By 1907, Rhyolite had electric lights, water mains, telephones, a hospital, a school, an opera house, and a stock exchange. 3 separate railroads ran to it. Population estimates vary widely, but the more careful ones put it between 3,500 and 5,000 people. The problem was lumber. Rhyolite sat in a treeless volcanic basin, and every board had to be hauled in at enormous cost. The town saloons, of which there were more than 50, produced empty glass bottles by the thousand for free. A miner named Tom Kelly did the arithmetic. In 1906, he built a house out of roughly 50,000 discarded whiskey and beer bottles, set in mortar. Then the town went. The 1906. San Francisco earthquake and the financial panic of 1907 choked off investment. In 1908, an independent survey found the Montgomery-Shoshone had been wildly overvalued and the stock collapsed. By 1910, there were 611 residents left. By around 1920, close to none. The Cook Bank is the building that stops people. 3 stories of concrete, roughly $90,000 to build, with time-locked vaults in the basement, imported stained glass, and Italian marble stairs. It was a roofless shell within about a decade. Ansel Adams photographed what was left of it. You can walk all of it today for free. The bank facade, the schoolhouse, the jail, the depot. Paramount Pictures restored the Bottle House in 1925 when film crews started using the ruins, and it is fenced now because of vandalism. Next door, the Goldwell Open Air Museum has stood since 1984, when Belgian artist Albert Sokalski installed a life-sized Last Supper in ghostly white out in the dirt. Every building Rhyolite raised with money is a ruin. The house a man made out of garbage is the one they had to put a fence around to protect. Number 8. Skidoo, the man they hanged twice. The town was named after an instruction to leave. In the 1900s, 23 Skidoo was popular slang meaning get out while the going is good. When the camp needed a name, a numerologist connected the phrase to the fact that its water pipeline ran exactly 23 miles from springs near Telescope Peak. That pipeline is the reason Skidoo existed at all. Two prospectors, lost in fog on their way to the Harrisburg strike, found gold here around 1905. Rhyolite mining magnate Bob Montgomery bought the claims for a reported $100,000, then built 23 miles of pipe across desert mountains to feed the only mill in the Death Valley region, powered almost entirely by water, running on gravity alone. The mine produced roughly 75,000 ounces of gold between 1906 and 1917. At its peak, the town held about 700 people, at 5,689 feet in the Panamint Mountains. Then in 1908, a saloon man named Joe Simpson, known as Hooch, walked into the store of James Arnold and shot him dead. Arnold was one of the town's founders and one of the best-liked men in it. Lawmen barely prevented an immediate lynching. On the night of April 22nd, an armed mob took Simpson out of custody and hanged him from a telephone pole. A passerby found the body the next morning. It remains the only hanging that ever took place in Death Valley. The story goes, and every source is careful to call it a story rather than documented fact, that when newspaper photographers arrived and found they had missed it, the town obliged them by hanging him a second time. What happened afterward is documented, and it is worse. Nobody in Skidoo would give Simpson a burial, so his body went into a prospect hole. The local doctor, who had once operated on Simpson's nose and wanted to study the case further, went out at night and removed the head. The skull was displayed in a showcase at Wildrose for a while, then disappeared. Years later, a prospector found a headless skeleton out in the desert and reported it, having no idea what he was looking at. Nothing of the town site is left but an interpretive sign at the end of 9 miles of unpaved road. The stamp mill still stands, stepping down several hundred feet into Telephone Canyon, and roughly 1,000 abandoned mine shafts pit the hills around it. A town named after a phrase meaning leave, which every single person eventually did. Number 7. Leadfield, the town that was never real. The promotional maps showed steamboats, ships steaming up the Amargosa River, carrying ore out from the mines at Leadfield. The Amargosa River is roughly 20 miles from Leadfield and is usually bone dry. 300 people moved there anyway. Titus Canyon really did have lead in it. Prospectors had established that as early as 1905. They had also established that hauling ore out to a smelter cost more than the ore was worth, so they stopped. In February 1926, an oil promoter named Charles C. Julian became president of Western Lead Mines. His contribution was not a discovery. He built a 22-mile road into the canyon, blasted new tunnels, and, according to accounts repeated for a century, seeded those tunnels with lead ore hauled in from Tonopah. The Park Service's own marker is more careful. It says only that fraud was alleged. Then he drew the maps and moved a river on them. The sales event was the masterpiece. Julian hired 90 private cars to bring 340 investors out into the desert, where 800 more prospective buyers were already waiting. There was a free lunch. There was a 6-piece band. Newspapers picked it up. Politicians picked it up. Company stock went from 10 cents a share to $3.30. The town site was platted with 1,749 lots. A cafe opened. A general store opened. And in August 1926, the United States federal government opened a post office in a town built on salted mines. It operated for about 6 months. By February 1927, the post office had closed. The fraud allegations had landed, Julian was bankrupt and gone, and everyone else drifted away. You can still reach it on Titus Canyon Road, which is the road Julian built. It runs one way only, westbound more than 26 miles of rough, single-lane track over Red Pass, and once you commit, there is no turning around. At the bottom, you find a few rusted tin buildings, a barn, mill foundations, prospect holes, and 2 locked mine shafts. The best thing Julian ever built was the road out. Number 6. Ballarat. Half coyote, half wild burro. Ask Charles Fergie whether he got lonely out here and he had an answer ready. He used it so often that when he died, they carved it on his headstone. Half coyote, half wild burro. Fergie was better known as Seldom Seen Slim. He arrived in Ballarat around 1917 and stayed roughly half a century, prospecting the Panamint Valley, living in a trailer once the adobe buildings gave out, and claiming he had not taken a bath in 20 years because water was too scarce to waste on it. Ballarat was founded in the late 1890s as a supply stop for men working the Ratcliffe mine. Named after a gold town in Australia by an immigrant called George Riggins, it held 400 to 500 people at its height, with 7 saloons, 3 hotels, a Wells Fargo station, a post office, a school, a jail, and a morgue. No church. The Ratcliffe mine suspended operations around 1903. The post office closed in 1917. The adobe walls began melting back into the ground because adobe is what you build with when there are no trees for 100 miles, but Ballarat never quite finished dying. Frank Harris, the same Shorty Harris who found the gold at Rhyolite, lived here on and off until his death in 1934. Slim outlasted everyone, and his funeral in 1968 was broadcast on television nationally. In the 1960s, a developer named Neil Cummins bought land east of town intending to build another Palm Springs out here. He gave up in 1988. Then there is the last chapter. In 1969, Charles Manson and his followers occupied Barker Ranch, south of Ballarat, up Goler Wash. On October 12th, a California Highway Patrol officer named Jim Purcell pulled Manson out of a small bathroom cabinet. At that point, nobody had connected the group to the Los Angeles murders. They were arrested for auto theft and for burning a park earth mover. The ranch house burned accidentally in 2009 and is a stone ruin now. Ballarat still has 1 or 2 full-time residents and a store that opens most afternoons. Among the rusted vehicles sitting in the dirt is a 1942 green Dodge Power Wagon, reportedly belonging to Manson family member Charles Watson, who used it to run from police during the raid. Slim spent 50 years telling people he was not lonely. History kept sending him company he never asked for. If you are finding this interesting, drop a thumbs up. It genuinely helps these get seen. And tell us in the comments which of these you would actually drive out to, because at least half of them will cost you a tire. We are halfway now, and the second half gets heavier. Number 5. Scotty's Castle. The mansion built on a lie nobody minded. Walter Scott was born in Kentucky in 1872 and spent about 12 years as a trick writer in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. When he left, he went into gold prospecting, which for him meant selling shares in a Death Valley mine that did not exist, to investors he was confident would never make the trip out to look at it. He was right about almost all of them. Then he sold shares to Albert Johnson, a Chicago businessman who had made his money in mines and insurance. Johnson came out to see where his money was going. Scott's response was to stage a gunfight with fake bandits, hoping to frighten him off. Johnson worked out that the whole thing was a scam. And then he did the thing that makes this story worth telling. He did not press charges. He liked the desert, the dry air agreed with his health, and he liked Scott. He brought his wife Bessie out. The 3 of them became friends and stayed friends for the rest of their lives. Over roughly 9 years starting in 1922, the Johnsons built a Spanish colonial villa in Grapevine Canyon, a spring-fed green notch in the middle of bare desert mountains. Imported tile, chandeliers, a clock tower, a pipe organ. Somewhere between $1.5 and $2.5 million in 1920s money 100 miles from anywhere. They called it Death Valley Ranch. Scott let the entire country believe it was his, funded by his secret gold mine. Newspapers ran with it. The name that stuck was Scotty's Castle. A park official recently described the place in its heyday as the stage for an enormous practical joke played on all of America. A mansion whose famous owner did not own it, credited in the public imagination to a mine that was never real and everyone involved knew. It was never finished. The Johnsons discovered the castle had been built on federal land by mistake, and then the Depression destroyed Albert's business. Construction stopped permanently. Scott was allowed to live there until he died in 1954, and he is buried on the hillside above it. The Park Service bought the property in 1970, and it became the most popular attraction in Death Valley, drawing more than 100,000 people a year. Then on October 17, 2015, roughly 3 inches of rain fell in 5 hours, and the flash flood took out the access road and the utilities. In 2021, during repairs, a fire destroyed the historic garage that had been serving as the visitor center. It stayed closed for 10 years. Limited flood recovery tours started again in early 2026. $35, 20 people at a time. They sold out. A con man's imaginary gold mine outlived him by 70 years, and people are still queuing up and paying to stand inside it. Number 4. Panamint City, the Silver Cannonballs. The men who founded this town were wanted for robbing a Wells Fargo stagecoach of $12,000. William Kennedy, Robert Stewart, and Richard Jacobs were hiding out in Surprise Canyon in December 1872 when they found silver in it. That created an awkward problem because you cannot file a claim while there is a warrant out for you. The claim ended up with men who had power. Nevada's sitting United States Senators John P. Jones and William Morris Stewart invested in the camp and promoted it hard. What grew was a mile of Main Street inside a mile-high canyon with roughly 2,000 people in it. Jones and Stewart floated 15 separate stocks on the San Francisco Mining Exchange with a combined face value of more than $61 million. And the silver kept getting robbed. Not occasionally. Constantly, and by people who knew exactly how the shipments moved because the town's population had come out of the same world its founders had. Wells Fargo eventually refused to serve the camp at all. The solution was pure engineering spite. Stop casting portable ingots. Cast the bullion into 400-pound blocks instead, too heavy for one man and a horse to lift off a wagon. One account holds that a member of the original bandit crew later complained to Senator Stewart that the giant ingots were not fair, and that Stewart asked whether he was supposed to feel sorry about that. The blocks worked. What killed Panamint City was not theft. The veins ran out faster than anyone had promised. William Ralston's Bank of California failed in August 1875, and investor confidence went with it. Then, on July 4, 1876, the camp threw a celebration for its new 30-stamp mill, ore cars running at full speed. 20 days later, hours of heavy rain came off the Panamint Peaks and sent a wall of water down Surprise Canyon, straight through the middle of Main Street. Cabins, stores, and saloons went with it. Total production for the entire district came to about $2.5 million, against $61 million in floated stock. There was a graded road up the canyon until 1983 when another flash flood scoured the lower canyon down to bedrock and rebuilding stopped being worth anyone's while. The only way in now is on foot. Roughly 7 miles and 4,000 feet of climbing, through waterfalls and washes, about 15 miles round trip. The brick smelter smokestack is still standing, and Kozo-style pictographs survive in rock shelters along the way. The town was built by men who understood theft better than almost anyone alive. And it was taken by the one thing you cannot outsmart. Number 3. Death Valley Junction and the Amargosa Opera House. She painted her own audience. The arithmetic did not work, and she solved it anyway. In July 1968, a New York dancer named Marta Beckett got a flat tire at a crossroads on the edge of Death Valley at 2,041 feet, where State Route 190 meets State Route 127. The town there had already died twice. The Pacific Coast Borax Company had built a long U-shaped Spanish colonial complex in 1923, including a recreation hall for its workers. Then the borax operation moved on. Then the railroad stopped, and the buildings were left to the desert. While the tire was being changed, Beckett walked over to the derelict hall and looked through the keyhole. She took it. There were 16 inches of dried mud on the floor. She was born in New York in 1924, and she had just decided that a collapsed company hall in a settlement of almost nobody was going to be her theater. Then came the obvious problem. There was no audience. The permanent population of Death Valley Junction was in single digits, and today it is fewer than 4 people. Most people would have advertised. Beckett painted. Starting in 1968, working alone on scaffolding, she covered 3 walls with a 16th century Spanish court. Kings, queens, nobles, packed into painted balconies, all of them facing her stage. That took 4 years. Then she spent 2 more on the ceiling. Clouds, blue sky, cherubs. 6 years of painting. 2 of her own cats are in there, curled up underneath the painted seats. Her first performance in 1968 was for an audience of 12 living people. From 1972 until 2012, she performed on a fixed schedule, on point whether or not a single ticket had been sold. If nobody came, she danced to the court on the walls. That was what the court was for. Her final show was February 12, 2012. Her life became the subject of an Emmy-winning documentary. She died at home in Death Valley Junction on January 30th, 2017 at 92, next door to the Opera House. The hotel and the Opera House still operate. The historic district is on the National Register of Historic Places, owned by the nonprofit Beckett founded, and the murals are still there to be seen. But as of this year, the buildings are losing. The manager describes constant flooding, failing plumbing, and adobe walls crumbling faster than the money comes in. Which means the audience she painted so that the room would never be empty is now going back into the ground along with the room. Number 2. Devil's Hole. The smallest home on Earth. Somewhere in the world, a fault slips. About 2 minutes later, in the Nevada desert 500 miles away, water starts moving in a hole in the rock. Devil's Hole is a fissure in limestone that opens into a flooded cavern connected to an aquifer of unknown depth. It sits in Nye County, a detached piece of Death Valley National Park set aside by presidential proclamation in 1952, and it is surrounded by a fence topped with razor wire. The fence is there for a fish, the Devil's Hole. Pupfish lives in the upper 80 feet of that cavern and on a single sunlit shelf of rock at its mouth, roughly the size of a large dining table. That shelf is the only place on Earth where the species can feed and spawn. It is the smallest range of any vertebrate animal on the planet. They were listed as endangered in 1967, among the first species in the United States to be listed at all. Because the cavern is plugged into a continental groundwater system, seismic energy from anywhere on Earth arrives here as water. Large earthquakes in Japan, Indonesia, and Chile have set it sloshing back and forth like a bathtub. The waves have reached 2 meters. When they do, they scrub the shelf clean. Algae, organic matter, eggs, all of it. Biologists have counted the fish nearly every spring and autumn since 1972, with divers working below 100 feet while others count from the surface. The numbers read like a heart monitor. Before the 1990s, autumn counts ran 4 to 500. In 2013, the population hit an all-time low of 35. In spring 2024, they counted 191, the best spring count since 1999. Then earthquakes in December 2024 and February 2025 stripped the shelf. The spring 2025 count found 38 fish, less than a fifth of the year before. There was nothing left on the ledge to eat, so biologists began hand supplementing their diet while the algae grew back and moved 19 captive-raised fish into the wild population from a 100,000-gallon concrete tank at Ash Meadows, built as a replica of the shelf and stocked from eggs collected starting in 2013. This spring, divers counted about 77 and reported plenty of juveniles. You can look at Devil's Hole from a fenced overlook. You cannot go into the water. An entire species, everything that has ever been, sitting on one rock ledge, waiting to find out what the rest of the planet does next. Number 1. Racetrack Playa. The rocks that sail. 27 miles of gravel gets you here, and it takes something from you on the way. Patience, usually, and often a tire. There is no phone signal for any of it. Then the road ends, and the ground in front of you stops making sense. It is flat. Not gently flat. Dead flat, pale gray, cracked into a mosaic of shallow polygons that runs unbroken to the mountains on every side. Nothing grows on it. A dark island of rock rises out of the middle, and somebody long ago named it the Grandstand, which tells you what people have always come here expecting to watch. The mud crunches under your boots. Past that, there is no sound at all. The silence is complete enough to be genuinely disorienting. And then you see the first trail. A shallow groove pressed into the surface, curving and doubling back for 100 meters or more, with a single dark stone sitting at the end of it. The stones are dolomite and syenite, eroded down off the surrounding mountains onto the lakebed. Some weigh around 700 pounds. They move. They carve those trails themselves across a surface with no meaningful slope. In the hottest place in North America. The first written account dates to 1915 from a prospector named Joseph Crook. People have studied the trails since the early 1900s, and for roughly a century, not one person ever saw a rock move. That is the whole reason this took so long to solve. The rocks are not shy. They are rare. They move perhaps once every 2 or 3 years, and they can sit motionless for over a decade between events. So explanations filled the gap where evidence should have been. Freak winds, magnetic fields, and inevitably, extraterrestrials. In 2011, 2 cousins decided to outweight the problem. Richard Norris and James Norris, working with planetary scientist Ralph Lorenz and with support from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and NASA, fitted motion-activated GPS units to 15 rocks, set up a time-lapse camera, and installed a weather station sensitive enough to register small changes in wind speed. Then they left and waited for something that might not happen for years. In the winter of 2013 into 2014, 2 years in, they happened to be standing there while the playa was flooded and frozen. Here is what actually happens. Rain forms a shallow pond on the lakebed, deep enough to float ice but shallow enough to leave the rocks exposed. Overnight, it freezes into a sheet of what the researchers call windowpane ice, a few millimeters thick. In the morning, the sun melts it and it breaks into large floating panels. A light wind pushes those panels across the pond. They come up against the rocks and they shove. The Norrises watched more than 60 rocks move at 7 to 16 feet per minute. The process is called ice shove. It is common in polar regions. It had never once been observed in a desert. So the answer to the strangest thing in the hottest place on the continent turned out to be ice thinner than a pane of glass, moving a 700-pound boulder at a slow walking pace in a landscape that regularly passes 120 degrees in summer. A companion paper published the same year suggested something quieter. Warming has already reduced how often the rocks move at all, compared with the 1970s. The playa is protected wilderness now, closed to vehicles. That has not stopped everyone. In August 2016, someone drove roughly 10 miles of loops and donuts across the surface, and volunteers went out afterward with rakes and water to erase it. Somebody else chiseled their initials 1/8 of an inch deep into one of the stones. The rocks will keep going regardless. Slowly, on the 2 or 3 winters in a decade that allow it, pushed by ice in a place built to have none. Nobody will be standing there for most of it. That was always the arrangement. Death Valley gets treated as one view from a car park, and it is really a couple of hundred separate stories that mostly ended badly. For me, it is the Opera House. A woman painting an audience because none was coming, then dancing to it for 40 years. That one stays with me. Which of these surprised you, and what did we miss? If you want more forgotten history like this, subscribe.